title, Agonistic Machine Learning, maybe a nice joke. Several people, when they saw the title, not just of this presentation, but I have written about it, and there it's also in the title, began an entire conversation with me about agnostic machine learning. It was also tweeted around, Hildebrandt speaking on agnostic machine learning. I was totally flabbergasted. Agnostic machine learning, what would that be? I have now changed the subtitle of the paper that I wrote about this to from agnostic to agonistic machine learning, so that everybody who makes the mistake, which I can understand is very easily made, is immediately from beginning to the end put right. And actually, I'm very happy that that people read it like that, because going from agnostic to agonistic machine learning is exactly what I'm trying to propagate. That is because many people think that since machine learning is done by computers, it must be true, and it must be objective, and it must be taken very serious, and that all the biases that we have as human beings will now finally be eradicated. And that if there is a bias, it is because the reality that the machine is trying to compress. I will explain that machine learning is a means to compress a data set into a mathematical formula. That is an agnostic affair, because the machine has no preferences, has no consciousness, no moral preferences. And I'm going to challenge that idea on the same grounds that you can defend the idea that machine learning is an agnostic affair, agnostic, so not knowing about what it's doing. On the same grounds, you can say that what we need is agonistic machine learning. That means that whenever an application or an infrastructure of machine learning is developed, usually that will be computer scientists sitting down with domain experts. Think of smart cities. They're a wonderful example, because smart cities are about everything. They're about traffic management, about violence management. They're about smart grid energy usage management. Any artificial intelligence that you can think of will also reappear in this idea of the smart city, even health. If you can monitor location and different points in time, you're monitoring mobility. If you can correlate that with visiting hospitals or not going to work, staying at home, then you already have a lot of data that medical science might be interested in. Okay, I want to talk about the ethics of agonistic machine learning. So agonism refers to adversariality. So when these domain experts sit down with the computer scientists to build these systems, I'm basically saying you should, at that moment, so in the early stages, bring in the people that are going to suffer or enjoy the consequences of the contractions, the infrastructures, and the architectures that are built. Not only because that is democratically the right thing to do, but also because that will build better systems that are more sustainable, more robust, because those systems are already tuned to the people who are going to be using them. So it's a double argument, and it means it's not only ethics, but it's also expediency, efficiency, effectiveness. Just one example I want to give in the beginning, and I want to return to it at the end. If you want to know about the implications of machine learning in real life, then the best thing to do is to go to the type of patents that big and extremely big companies apply for. So don't wait for them to to use those patents, but just look at what they are after. And sometimes that comes into the news. So recently it was found out that Amazon has filed for a patent for a wristband that tracks warehouse workers' movements. Well, what's new about that? It's this morning when I gave a lecture, there was somebody who came to me who's been around even longer than me on this world. And he started talking about Taylorism. He said, well, there's nothing new at all with blah, 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 blah. Very true, but there is something different about this particular patent. The wristband doesn't only monitor your movements, but it also, via the back-end system, as computer scientists call what happens behind the screen, what you don't see, it figures out that your way of doing things could be done better if you move your hand that way instead of doing this, because that takes more time. And Amazon.com is, of course, interested in reducing labor cost, etc. So instead of giving text to the person and saying the next time you have to do this, which the person may not understand, and you speak to that person, to the part of the body of that person that you want to change its position. That means the wristband doesn't just monitor, but it also uses haptic movements to tell not you, but this part of you immediately that you have to change position. Now I think that's extremely interesting. It would of course be even more interesting if I can then talk back the same way. So I feel that the system wants me to do this, and I do this, like get out of my way, I'm not going to do that. So here you see systems not just observing, but actually acting on a person, and we can have the whole surveillance debate on that, all very interesting. I don't want to go into that now. I'm now thinking about the agency of these systems and how it would influence the agency of the employee. And whether the moment will come that we can force Amazon.com to develop a new patent which allows me to engage with, though that's a very vague term, it can mean anything, to interact with the system, to speak back to it with my hand. And here we have, of course, the more normal Fitbit. We've undoubtedly all seen this. It would be a great joke if it wasn't also making people very vulnerable, of course. The most interesting I found this, which is basically scientific research, empirical research, which says, well, it doesn't work. You can use it, that's no problem. And if you want to believe that it works, that's also no problem. Self-deception is a common human trait, but it doesn't really work. So it's PR. I think that's there are many lessons here. There are many lessons here, maybe even more than in the two previous slides. Okay, so I decided to send a title, The Ethics of Agonistic Machine Learning, and I want to do a very simple thing, talk a bit about how I understand ethics, how I understand agonism, something about how I understand machine learning, and then, of course, we come to the ethics of agonistic machine learning. So there are many theories about ethics. It can be about doing the right thing. It can be about doing the good thing, which is not the same in these theories. And it can be about doing the best thing. And there's also something that has been called ethical wisdom. And the way I have framed it, you can see that the first three are theories about what is the right, the good, and the best decision. And the fourth is interested in acting right or good or best. So maybe you have a theory about what you have to do in a particular situation, and after you have calculated and deliberated and argued with yourself, you come to the right or the good or the best thing to do. But then suddenly you think, hey, I have a mortgage to pay. Let's not do it today. when I have paid off my mortgage, I will do the right, the good, or the best thing. The fourth position is not interested in arguing, deliberating, rationalizing whether we can do that. It's interested whether we are capable of doing the right thing, mostly intuitively. And I find that a very interesting position. So the first, doing the right thing, that is usually called deontological ethics. It basically derives from the Kantian categorical imperative as opposed to his hypothetical imperative. So it basically says when you have to make a decision that has moral implications, you should always respect the autonomy of the human being, that is, or the rational being that is going to be affected by your decision. That means a hypothetical imperative would mean that you are aiming to get from A to B and you're just considering what gets you there best or fastest. And Kant says that has nothing to do with morality. Morality means that you are not considering the consequences, but are really looking at what is the right decision here. And the right decision for Kant is the decision that respects the autonomy of the human we use. And I'm purposely articulating it in this way because many people say, they repeat his categorical imperative by saying that you're never allowed to use a human being because that doesn't respect that human being's autonomy. But it's not at all what he says. He says, do not merely use other human being, but when you use that other human being, always respect that person's autonomy. And I think that is an important qualification that that makes it much more difficult. So think of a government and the sort of decisions that a government has to make. Government will nearly always be using human beings one way or another. So the Kantian imperative doesn't mean, oh, you're not allowed to do that. You have to sit somewhere in an ivory tower and think about everything except the consequences of what you're doing. That's not what Kant said. And the challenge to be using people while respecting their autonomy, that's a much bigger challenge, of course. Also because it's a realistic challenge. There's a famous legal philosopher who said that the core of both the rule of law and democracy is equal respect and concern for individual persons. I think that's a great find. Democracy and rule of law are often opposed to each other, and this is the only maxim that shows that they have the same root. So if you say we must have equal respect and concern for each individual, that is a most wonderful explanation of representative democracy. So it's not just the people who pay taxes, or who pay a lot of taxes, or who have a university degree, or who simply have a lot of money, or the people that are so smart that they don't pay any taxes. It's not just those people that get to vote, but everybody. That means there is equal respect and concern. After this voting, we get a majority to rule. In my definition of democracy, democracy is a system where majority rules in a way that allows minorities to become a majority. So if you put a stop behind democracy is a system where the majority rules, that's totally boring. That's majority dictatorship. We've seen that populism, problem. If you take each and every person seriously, if you respect the autonomy of each and every person, then you must say that at some point an individual person can decide to align with another political party or whatever. And that's the meaning of minorities must be able to become majorities. So I'm not talking about majorities as women or black people or whatever. I'm talking about the minority of opinion that has not won the elections, that this minority might with the next election become a majority. And that puts a burden on the majority that rules to do it in such a way that major decisions are not irreversible or take into account in other ways the minority that might become a majority. So that makes governing a bit more difficult, but also more interesting. Of course, after the majority gets to rule of law means that there are individual human rights that even a majority cannot overrule. So there you see that the same maxim is also the root of the rule of law. Now, of course, we can have discussions about whether autonomy assumes sentience. So, can machines be autonomous in that sense? Does autonomy assume reason? Must we be able to reason? So, my cat is very sentient and it does reason, but it's clever enough not to show that to us. So, you won't believe it, I know, but anyway. So, animals. We assume do not reason, at least not in our way. Are animals autonomous or not? And taking both sentience and reason one step further is eccentricity. So the ability to take the perspective of another. Is that maybe an assumption for an entity to be autonomous? And I just want to tell a very brief story to show what I mean. If a small child, let's say 1.5 years, I talk to that child, and that child learns by imitating. So I say to the child, "You are Charlotte, I am Mireille." And the child says, "Yes." And it says, "You are Charlotte, I am Mireille." And I say, "No, you are Charlotte and I am Mireille." The child says, "Yes, you are Charlotte and I am Mireille." It is repeating. So the child says, "What does this woman want from me?" After some time, this doesn't happen suddenly, after some time the child gets it. And it means, some people call that the birth of the subject. So a baby is born. But that minute that the child looks back at itself from the position of the other, that is the birth of the child as a person, as a subject, and I would say that's also the start of an autonomous being. The start, it's of course rudimentary. My cat, anyway, let's not talk about it yet. So the question that this type of ethics asks is, does a specific machine learning application respect the autonomy of the human beings that it targets? Clear. Then we have another stream that does virtue ethics, Aristotelian ethics, more asking about the good thing to do than the right thing. So you could say this is about striving how to develop your moral compass. It's very much about experience. The idea that experience and not logic, not deliberation, not argumentation, but experience is what allows you at some point to do the good thing. And that means there is what Aristotle has called practical wisdom involved, phronesis, not to be confused with practical in the sense of how do I get fastest from A to B, but practical in the sense of having a rich experience that allows you to foresee that if you make a decision it will have a lot of implications for other people and that you need to consider that. So it's the difference between being a very rational person and being a wise person. That's not clearly not the same thing. And so Aristotle says mathematicians are at their best when they're 18. After that, they only become less good. But for instance, a judge, a court becomes better the older she gets. Aristotle would have definitely not said she, but So it's about character, not about calculation. It's individualist, situationalist, rather than rule-based. So you could ask the question: does a specific machine learning application enable or inhibit developing one's moral compass? So if you can inscribe certain moral rules into the technology, then you are diminishing the normative. You're shrinking the normative order, because we don't have to make those decisions anymore, and we don't get the experience to make them. Some people say we shouldn't have cars that help us to not make bad decisions when we drive. For instance, a car that simply will not leave if it has sensed that you are under the influence of alcohol. But there are many other ways to check whether you're fit for driving. And I had whole discussions with Roger Brownsworth, who is extremely, I have very high esteem for him. He's an analytical philosopher in this field, law and these sort of technologies. And he says, well, that means that when we drive a car, we no longer have to practice our moral capabilities. And I said to him, but Roger, what if my child dies because somebody is trying to practice his moral capabilities while driving his car? I'm not interested. I'd rather have that in the car so that my child doesn't die. So I'm not saying that there aren't all types of applications where we would prefer the applications to make these sort of decisions. I'm not saying that that is necessarily a bad thing. But I think there's a difference, for instance, between driving a car and speaking the law. There it becomes a different issue, and I hope to explain that. The third way of looking at ethics is utilitarianism. That means you're basically going to look at the consequences of your potential decisions, and then you're going to rank them based on cost benefits. For instance, you say, well, there's a plane flying over and it's been hijacked, and there are 300 people there, and it's basically also threatening to fly into a city with 4,000 potential victims. So let's calculate, we can shoot the plane now, then the 300 people will be dead and some people that are underneath, but at least not those 3,000, so we shoot the plane. That would be that could be a utilitarian calculation. And actually there's a famous court case in Germany where there was legislation that gave the authority to, I think, the military to take a decision on that basis, and the Supreme Court of Germany, the Constitutional Court of Germany, decided that we cannot calculate with human lives, and that authority for that reason was unlawful. Let's not go into the details. There are many arguments to be made on all accounts, but it shows what utilitarianism could be about. Now, of course, utilitarians are very clever people, so usually they're not talking about ad hoc decisions like I'm now deciding where to shoot somebody or not, and I'm going to check the implications. That's a bad guy. He may become president, and the amount of bad things he could do is enormous. So if I shoot him now, just calculate, all the good things that I do. Some people would like to make that calculation. Utilitarians usually think in terms of rules. So they think, what sort of rules could we make that if everybody stuck to that rule would give less costs and more benefits than another type of rule? And that comes very close actually to Kant's categorical imperative, where he says, think whether your action follows from a rule that you would want everybody to follow. So if you're going to lie, because you think that has very positive implications, just try to think, if everybody would lie, whether we would all be very happy. So rule utilitarianism and Kantian categorical imperative bien étonné de se trouver ensemble. Many people would not agree, but I think in practice they're quite close. Utilitarianism is based on calculation. That means on calculability. You can only calculate if things are calculable. That means there is a tertium comparationis, usually utility or preferences, because if you want to calculate, you must find a unit in which you calculate. So originally, as the word utilitarianism says, it was about utility. But that it turned out that your utility is not my utility, so now it's usually preferences. Calculation also assumes qualification. So after you have decided what to calculate, you have to, every time you are adding up things, qualify those things under the same heading. So if you're going to add apples to pears, you can do that if you qualify both as fruit. But if you want to qualify in terms of apples, you have to decide that a pear is not an apple. And this is something that in empirical, in social science, but also in computer science is often forgotten or hidden, that any quantification assumes qualification. I think that's a very important insight. And then you ask the question, does a specific machine learning application provide more benefits than costs? And of course you may want to correct the outcome of your inquiry for distribution effects, because maybe it has more benefits than costs, but all the benefits go to one person and all the costs go to the rest, or the other way around. So we have Rawlsian maximum principles to correct for that. Considering the time, I will not go into that. There is a wonderful little book, which I would advise anybody immediately when you get home to buy it, by Francisco Varela, under the title of Ethical Wisdom. Varela was, together with Maturana, coined the term autopoiesis. After that, Luhmann went and did all sorts of strange things with it, which Varela and Maturana were very surprised about and didn't agree with. Luhmann got to be very famous, Varela, Maturana, maybe not. But Varela is a biologist, later became very interested in brain science, neuroscience. And he was a phenomenologist and a pragmatist, philosophical speaking. Now he writes in this little book in the beginning, those who demand a detached critical morality based on prescriptive principles, there are those, and there are those who pursue an active and engaged ethics based on a tradition that identifies the good. When he says, at first approximation, let me say that a wise or virtuous person is one who knows what is good and spontaneously does it. It is this immediacy of perception and action which we want to examine critically. This approach stands in stark contrast to the usual way of investigating ethical behavior, which begins by analyzing the intentional content of an act and ends by evaluating the rationality of particular moral judgments. So basically he's saying, instead of thinking about ethics, let's find ways to be ethical persons. And of course he's then going to write about that. The question that you would ask is, does a particular machine learning application overrule, nourish, enable, or discourage enacting ethical wisdom? Okay, now I've done ethics, let's do agonism. So Chantal Mouffe is actually a Belgian political theorist. She's at London School of Economics, I think, for a very long time. And she says there are basically three theories of democracy. The first we've already talked about is representative democracy. So that means you consider the opinion of people as individual things, these opinions that you can calculate with. You aggregate them. And basically it seems like you see votes as preferences, like in utilitarianism. You could also have an argumentation for representative democracy, as I discussed earlier, based on equal respect and concern. So that is the deontological underlying. Now, next to representative democracy, there is a theory of deliberative democracy. So the fact, of course, we have to count votes, and then that's a decision system to say who gets to govern for 4 years. But real democracy happens in Parliament, where there is deliberation, argumentation, and if people in Parliament are really doing their best to find the best type of rules, they will achieve a rational consensus. The assumption of deliberative democratic theory, Rawls, Habermas, etc., is that you will come at some point to a rational consensus, also from the side of utilitarianism. And Habermas tried to save this perspective on deliberative democracy by saying, well, rationality must be seen in a very broad way, also understanding it from the aesthetic and ethical perspective. So not just expediency, not just getting the fastest from A to B. Chantal Mouffe said, this is of course an illusion. It's an illusion to start with the assumption that we're all going to rationally find a consensus. That assumes that somewhere out there is already the solution, and by rational discussion we will find it. And she says, well, even if it were true, it isn't true. Go look around. People are going to fundamentally disagree with each other. So let's take for granted that that is what is happening and not the opposite, because that will make you stronger. So she takes a perspective that is more informed by pragmatism in a philosophical sense, hermeneutics, and people like Wittgenstein, so an expectancy theory of norms. Basically, she is saying to have a viable democracy with well-functioning institutions, you need to ensure that different voices are heard to achieve a robust outcome. That also means, she also goes back to John Dewey, the pragmatist, that you must enable publics, not just one public, but different publics, to constitute issues. So I have delegated politics to my representatives so that I can do my own things. Then suddenly I discover they're not doing very well. Then I have to find others. I have to create a public around issues. I have to find others that equally care and agree with me that my representatives and their representatives are not doing a good job. So for John Dewey and Chantal Mouffe, democracy is working hard. And she then calls that an agonistic form of democracy. So she says this is not about antagonism, like you say A, I'm going to say B. No, that's childish and dangerous. We're talking about the public good. It's about you say something, I feel it's wrong, but I say he's such a nice person, let it be. Or I say, my mortgage, let's not say that now. So she is saying it is so important to have people voice their opinion and discuss. Not because a rational consensus will suddenly come out of the air, but because it will enable better solutions that take into account far more than if you restrict the discussion to what somebody says is rational. One of the things of agonism is that there's nobody who has the ultimate answer to whether your presentation of your concern is rational or not. The idea is this is your concern and it has to be respected, and now we're going to have a conversation about that. But nobody is going to say, yeah, that's your concern, but you're a very emotional person and we now have to have a rational discussion, so you can come back when you have washed your emotions away. So she's saying that is not going to bring us That's not going to bring us good outcome of democratic procedures. Agonism, entirely independent of Chantal Mouffe, was also used by Arie Rip, professor of constructive technology assessment, CTA, which he describes as a process of learning. So technology assessment, participatory technology assessment, PTA, is a means to say when new types of technologies are developed, we have to sit down together with the people who are going to suffer the consequences. It's also connected with pragmatism and Dewey. Because that will make for better outcome, for more robust outcome in the design of these technologies. Well, considering the time, I think I shall move on to machine learning. So many of the things that Arie Rip says are similar to what Chantal Mouffe says, but he talks about it at a much more concrete level in relation to the building, the developing of technologies. Okay, so machine learning, according to the one of the big men in machine learning who wrote a famous handbook, in which he writes an introductory chapter, and there he defines machine learning. He says machine learning, or a computer program, is set to learn from experience E with respect to some class of tasks T. I've given the example of law after that. Performance measure P, compare that, again an example for law. If performance at tasks T, as measured by P, improves with experience E. I always say this is like poetry and mathematics. So all the ambiguities, all the extra languages out. This is what machine learning is. Basically, this means that any machine learning system parasites on human domain expertise. Why? Because to formulate task T and to determine performance metric P, you need a domain expert. So, if you want a machine learning system to be able to do artificial legal intelligence, you're going to feed a lot of legal text. You're going to label that text. That means you're going to take out part of the text which you think are important. So statutes, case law, what have you, doctrine. And then you're going to feed that system case law, outcome of cases. And what you're asking the system to do is to find the mathematical formula that connects the input with the output. That's called the target function, so a mathematical function. That's all any machine learning system does. It means all depends on your input data, which is called training data. So if you want to do machine learning, you have this data, you divide it, say 80% you use to train your algorithm. You tweak the mathematical formula, or you allow the system to do that itself. That is now possible, neural nets, etc. You train the algorithm until it gets it right nearly all the time. Usually it's approximation. So you have a formula that, based on the input data, connects with the output data. When you have the optimal, people always talk about optimization, which is a mathematical concept. When you have the optimal function, you take the 20% that you had left out and you check whether, you validate whether it works. Of course, it is very important after that to test whether it also works out of sample, when you get new data. If you don't do that and you sell it, because this stuff is getting sold, right? This is about consultants, they have to make a living. Maybe they don't have time to test it again, or maybe they say, I've already, for instance, you use 3 different performance metrics. The one metric says, do you get it right half of the time? Yes or no? That's the performance metric. The other says, do you get it right 8 out of 10 times? As you can understand, the outcome rather depends on your performance metric. And this is a very obvious one, so anybody could see it. But there are very many ways to tweak performance metrics. So if you're a consultant and you have to pay your mortgage, then you're going to try out different performance metrics. Of course, you're going to do your best with the data and with the mathematical formula. But at some point, you have to deliver. So you say, okay, now let's pick that performance metric, because that performance metric says that the system is getting it very much right. And you're not going to tell anybody about the other performance metrics. That's possible. The performance metric and the task is based on what computer scientists call the ground truth, which in the beginning, when we began to interact with computer scientists, we found extremely funny. We kept asking them, what in heaven's name is the ground truth? One of my PhD students, in every presentation that she gave on these subjects, she had one slide with a coffee mill where she talked about the ground truth. The truth that first has to be ground. Of course, the word ground for computer scientists means something else. But the performance metric depends on the ground truth. So there's a lot of talk about how fantastic, for instance, ML does in terms of radiology. So imagine you have 3 radiologists that you ask to help the data scientists to build a very good system. So they look at the X-rays, and the first one says, well, this is clearly an appendix. The second one says, I don't understand how you ever got to that idea. Certainly not an appendix, it is just a rash in a part close to the appendix of the, there's no problem at all. And the third one says something close to one of them. Now, to make the system work, you need the ground truth, the output data. You must tell the system, this X-ray, according to a real radiologist, means that, because you want to train the system. That's a bit problematic if your 3 radiologists don't agree, which is not uncommon amongst radiologists. So what do? You say, well, you know, the second guy, he's always a very problematic sort of radiologist. We just don't have to listen to him. The others are round and about saying the same thing, so we take the average. And then we say, this is what radiologists qualify as the output for this X-ray. Yeah? And this, what the radiologists say, you call it the ground truth. Now you see why it is not just ground in the sense of in the field, on the ground, but it's also ground in the sense that the ground truth is usually has been ground before it is frozen. Because it has to be frozen, otherwise you can't teach the machine anything. The same, of course, goes for legal artificial intelligence. Many times it is difficult to get hold of data, or difficult to even get hold of ground truth. So one solution is to use so-called synthetic data. That means you look at the data that you have, and then you say, well, I'm going to add data. This is done by computer scientists in a very reliable way. We're going to add data that we make up, but not just make up like that, but they make them up according to certain scientific procedures. So they work with synthetic data, and that also feeds into the ground truth or on the side of the input data. The fact that a computer scientist who's doing scientific research in a university knows how to construct synthetic data and probably uses 12 different methods to construct synthetic data for a particular problem, and then tries to see which type of synthetic data for this particular problem is the best approximation of the real data. The fact that that is the case doesn't mean that a consultant who's in a hurry and who's read about synthetic data and also did a course in machine learning is also going to make all that effort. No, he will say there is scientific evidence that you can use synthetic data, and I've really thought about it very well. Okay, so the politics here is in who gets to determine the experience, the task, and the performance metric. Who decides which training data are used? Who decides how these data are curated? When you have a data set, it can seldom be used just like that because there's a lot of noise there. Wrong input data, irrelevant data. Computer scientists call the curation of the data set to prepare it to go into the system as input data cleansing, which I find a wonderful word. So not cleaning, but cleansing. It's like I don't cleanse my laundry, but computer scientists cleanse their data. It has a very specific technical meaning. Who decides how the data is cleansed? We can all understand that if you cleanse them very carefully, which costs a lot of time and domain expertise, the system is going to be much more expensive than if you say, well, can you cleanse it like you did last week with the other data set? I'm maybe saying things which might sound ridiculous, but I'm very worried that this is what is happening every day. So I'm not just joking. The ethics are in how they are actually determined, E, T, and P. This is about if there is a bias in the database, for instance, the whole story of predictive policing and predictive sentencing in the United States. If there is a bias in the data, how are you going to take that particular bias, an unwarranted bias, into account in your system? And there are people who say, well, you take race out of the database. But if you're talking about machine learning, the data point race definitely correlates with 3 or 4 other data points. So you're not solving any problem, you're just making it invisible. So you better not take race out, because if you keep it in, you can at least see the bias. Now, okay, so we have politics. Who get to decide this are the people who are going to suffer the consequences of these systems. Involved, we have ethics, good thinking about what are the implications, well, all these questions that are articulated. And law, of course, concerns the contestability. Can somebody come and say, oh, how interesting, you trained these algorithms on this data set. Did you also train it on another data set? Was the outcome different? Can you explain that? Why should I then use this output? Or, okay, so you trained this algorithm, this particular type of algorithm on this data. Did you also try out different algorithms? Did you try out different performance metrics? Can I see them? Wow, with that performance metric, we suddenly get very bad performance. Why did you use this one? Do we get to have this conversation? So this conversation is what I mean with agonistic machine learning. Now, the core assumption of machine learning is that there is a mathematical relation between the input and the output data. So it assumes that all the things that we do as lawyers, I'm a lawyer, is all very interesting, but underlying it is a mathematical function. If you don't believe that, don't do machine learning. So we have to assume that, otherwise you cannot do machine learning, right? Okay. There's a wonderful text by McKillen under the title of Machine Neoplatonism. So there, in the Middle Ages and especially after that, there was the assumption that we have reality, we live in reality, but underlying reality there is mathematics, and that is the real reality. We are just messy instantiations of that. If you really want to know what's happening, you should go to the mathematical level. In science, this has had an enormous impact from beginning of modernity, 16th century geometric perspective in science. And McKillen says, you now see that this Neoplatonic understanding of reality, that the real reality is mathematics, is getting a machinic consequence. So the machines that we are interacting with at this moment, to a large extent online, but think of cloud robotics, think of self-driving cars, think of Internet of Things, smart cities, etc. This Neoplatonism is now getting a machinic effect. There was a famous conversation between Dawkins and Zuckerberg. If you're famous, you get to talk with each other. Where Dawkins asked Zuckerberg, what really interests you? What would you really like to know? Is there something that you want? Why are you doing all this? Is it the money or? And then he said, well, I'm actually curious about whether there is a fundamental mathematical law underlying human social relationships that governs the balance of who and what we all care about. And he says, I bet there is. So why does Facebook want all this data? To get richer? Of course not. Zuckerberg has had many offers to sell his business for incredible amounts of money. The business has so much money it could buy 3 or 4 governments if it wanted, right? He's not interested in money. He's not stupid, so he knows that to survive he must be interested in money, and he knows how to do these things. But his real motivation and incentive is to find this mathematical formula, and we are giving him the data to uncover that formula. Now we can sit down and have a laugh and say that's not possible. We can say, well, that's a dream of a geek. But it happens to be a very powerful geek who happens to be able to influence people, not in the sense that he has control over the social network. I don't believe that at all, because I don't believe in this assumption at all. But as long as everybody else believes it, it has effects. The system is basically run by the advertising model, of course. Many people say, what if all these people that are interested in artificial intelligence stop investing all their effort in making us click on the right advertisement, right? That's where all the effort is going. What if we stop doing that and put all that effort into things that we, as a polity, find interesting? And my personal opinion, not entirely uninformed, I think, is that at one moment the advertisers, so the people who produce toothpaste or bags or what you want, the advertisers are going to discover that this whole advertising model has the emperor's clothes. That they get, like people say, oh, Facebook is sharing my personal data with all these advertisers. No, Facebook does not share even one personal data with anybody, certainly not with advertisers. They allow you, if you pay for it, to advertise at a certain space. But you don't get to see that space at all. And you sort of have to trust that it actually happens. So, once again, at some point I think advertisers will wake up and say, why are we doing this? I'm looking forward to that moment. Okay, last remarks about agonistic machine learning. There's a famous guy, Duncan Watts. He's one of the founding fathers of the science of networks. He wrote this book in which he claims that based on research he did, we're all connected via 6 nodes. So I know you, you know somebody that knows somebody that knows somebody that knows somebody that knows me. It's a myth. When you actually look at the book and at the research that he did, it certainly doesn't follow. But it's a nice myth that we keep telling each other. And what good it does, I don't know. But he's become very famous with it. And there is no doubt about the fact that he's an excellent researcher. He's the first to say that the conclusions that people have drawn from his book are outrageous. So in an article in which he argues that we should focus less on interpretation and more on prediction, something that I don't agree with. So I decided to dissect the article, to read it really well, to be able to argue against him. And there it was like a trove. I found a treasure, because he makes a difference in that article between exploratory machine learning research design and confirmatory machine learning design. So he explains exploratory machine learning as researchers that study different tasks. So you define different tasks and then see what happens. Fit multiple models. In computer science terms, that is, you develop a hypothesis space. So what you're after is the target function between input and output. It's a mathematical function. But that function is not given. You don't know it. So you develop a space, as mathematicians say, with hypothesis of that function. That's something for mathematicians. It's all very complex. But you can develop a large hypothesis space, a very multi-dimensional hypothesis space that uses a lot of features, a lot of data points, or a smaller one. A large one is definitely not always better than a smaller one, but there are many different ways to do that, depending on the problem that you want to solve. So exploratory research design means you have experimented with, for instance, different hypothesis spaces. Try out different exclusion rules. So you say, okay, if we don't take this sort of data points into account, what happens? If that doesn't make a difference, I don't need those data, I don't need to collect them, for instance. Test on multiple performance metrics, we've already discussed that. But then he says, and here it turns out that Duncan Watts is the first agonistic machine learner in the world. He says, when reporting their findings, these researchers should transparently declare their full sequence of design choices. For instance, to avoid creating false impressions of having actually confirmed hypothesis rather than simply having generated one. So the target function is called a hypothesis about the relationship between input and output. And then he said they should report performance in terms of multiple metrics. So if you do exploratory research, you use multiple metrics to see what works best, and they should report on that and show what they did, to avoid creating a false appearance of accuracy. Now, if you've played around with different types of exploratory research design, and you're convinced that you've now found the best hypothesis, then you start doing confirmatory research. And he says, if you do that, so if you're going to claim that this is really the best approximation of this mathematical function, then you should be required to pre-register your research design. I don't know if you're aware of that, but I think now 10, 15 years ago, in medical journals, medical science journals, it is a requirement if you want to be published to pre-register your research design. If you don't do it, they say throw it out, because it doesn't mean anything. We don't know how you started, we don't know how you tweaked stuff. We're not publishing it. It's not science, that is whatever you want to call it. Basically, Duncan Watts is arguing the same thing should happen to machine learning application. So if you want to claim, for instance, in medical science, basically he's talking about scientific research, of course, that you have confirmed the hypothesis, then you have to put your cards on the table in advance and explain exactly what happened. So that means all the decisions about pre-processing choices, the cleansing of the data, how you did it, model specifications, your hypothesis space, evaluation method, performance metric. And you must show that you did out-of-sample predictions. So you have this data set that you divide into training and validation. Don't call the validation set test data. That's not test data, that's validation data. That's all in the realm of description. If you want to confirm, you have to, after you finish your research, you have to go and find other data and see if it works. And then he does suggestions about what sort of publicly accessible register could be used for this. So, agonistic machine learning would require that those who may suffer or enjoy the consequences of an application are invited to join the early stage of the research design, are primed in the relevant design choices and their trade-offs, maybe by independent machine learning experts and domain experts, are invited to uncover new concrete trade-offs. Each design decision in machine learning design has trade-offs. There is no decision that doesn't have trade-offs. And these trade-offs are very concrete. They're not philosophy. They mean that your system gets ready fast, but is not very accurate. They mean that the system is very accurate, but gets it all wrong. Google pneumonia and machine learning. There's a famous example now around of a system that wanted to check the factors that influence morbidity within a certain time limit of people that have contracted pneumonia. The system had a very high accuracy and got it entirely wrong. And that article shows very nicely how come. We don't have time for it, but anyway. So these people should be invited to uncover new concrete trade-offs. They should be able to participate in the construction of the application or raise actionable objections against the application. So it shouldn't just be in, you have to help me, the company, for instance, or the government, to make this application, but they should also be able to say, but this application has only costs. This application doesn't respect the autonomy of the humans it targets. For instance, it reduces all of us to manipulable data points. We don't like that. Does it enable or inhibit developing one's moral compass? Does it actually diminish or bypass people's agency? Does a specific machine learning application unfairly redistribute benefits and costs? People always talk about benefits and costs as if that's at issue, but often it's about the distribution of risks, for instance. Does it induce new types of exclusion, create or redistribute vulnerability and risks? Does a particular machine learning application overrule, nourish, enable, or discourage enacting ethical wisdom? Does it create or remove affordances to act on one's moral compass, to actually care, to actually take care, to protect, and to make a difference? Or does it turn human beings into puppets that do not make any difference anymore because the systems are already doing everything? And considering all the trade-offs that are at the basis of these systems, that is not only problematic from the ethical perspective, but also from the perspectives of expediency, etc. And all these questions that I just raised, you can ask for these tracking stuffs. Okay, so this is my conclusion.